The handcuffs clicked shut on a cold January morning in 2024, and with that metallic sound, a ghost that had haunted a small Tennessee community for nearly 3 decades finally found its voice. The man being led from his modest home in Davidson County wasn't some drifter or stranger. He was a neighbor, someone people had seen at the grocery store, at church socials, at high school football games on Friday nights. His arrest sent a shockwave through a town that had learned to live with an unanswered question, a community that had built scar tissue over a wound that never properly healed. But now, after 29 years of silence, the truth was about to surface, and it would prove more devastating than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and it means we can keep telling the stories that deserve to be remembered. The arrest came quietly, almost anticlimactically, for a case that had dominated headlines and broken hearts back in 1995. Tennessee Bureau of Investigation agents, working in coordination with local authorities, had been building their case for months, running DNA through databases that didn't exist when Melissa M. Johnson was killed, using technology that would have seemed like science fiction to the detectives who first worked her case. When they finally had enough to move forward, they didn't announce it to the media. They simply drove to a small house on Maple Street, knocked on the door, and when it opened, they spoke words that had been waiting nearly 3 decades to be said. The man who answered showed little emotion, according to witnesses. He'd had a long time to prepare for this moment, or perhaps he'd convinced himself it would never come, but it had. And now, the wheels of justice that had stalled out in 1995 were finally beginning to turn again. To understand why this arrest shattered a community that thought it had moved on, you have to go back to who Melissa was before she became a headline, before she became a cold case file gathering dust in a basement archive. You have to go back to 1995, to a Tennessee that felt smaller and safer, to a young woman who had her whole life spread out before her like an open road on a summer day. Melissa Marie Johnson was 23 years old in the spring of 1995, and if you asked anyone who knew her, they'd tell you she was the kind of person who lit up a room without trying. She had one of those laughs that was contagious, the kind that made everyone around her start smiling, even if they didn't know what was funny. She'd grown up in Davidson County, the youngest of 3 children in a tight-knit family that had roots in Tennessee going back generations. Her father worked at the local manufacturing plant. Her mother was a school secretary, and their home on Hickory Lane was the kind of place where neighbors borrowed sugar and everyone knew everyone's business, usually before you knew it yourself. Melissa had graduated from the local high school in 1990, where she'd been a cheerleader and a member of the drama club, someone who moved easily between different social circles because she genuinely liked people and they liked her back. She wasn't the valedictorian or the prom queen, but she was voted most likely to brighten your day in the senior yearbook, and that probably captured her essence better than any academic achievement could have. After graduation, she worked various jobs around town, saving money trying to figure out what she wanted to do with her life. By 1995, she was working as a waitress at a family restaurant on the edge of town, the kind of place with vinyl booths and unlimited coffee refills where regulars had their own seats, and Melissa knew everyone's order by heart. Her co-workers remember her as someone who never complained, even when the Friday night rush got overwhelming or when difficult customers treated her like she was invisible. She had dreams of maybe going to nursing school, or perhaps cosmetology school. She loved doing her friends' hair and makeup for special occasions, had a natural talent for it. Her apartment, a small 1-bedroom she'd rented above a hardware store downtown, was decorated with magazine cutouts and inspiration boards, evidence of a young woman still figuring out who she wanted to become. She dated occasionally but wasn't serious with anyone at the time. She was close with her siblings, especially her older sister, and she called her mother almost every day, usually while getting ready for work, phone tucked between her shoulder and ear while she applied mascara or searched for her keys. The Tennessee of 1995 was a different world in some ways. Cell phones existed but were rare and expensive. Social media was years away from being invented. When you wanted to know where your friends were, you called their house phone or you just showed up at the places you knew they'd be. The town where Melissa lived had a population of about 15,000 people, small enough that crime felt like something that happened somewhere else, in bigger cities, to people you didn't know. There was a main street with local shops, a movie theater that showed films about 3 weeks after they premiered in Nashville, a diner that made the best biscuits and gravy in the county. Friday nights meant high school football. Sundays meant church and family dinners. It was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, where everyone assumed tomorrow would look pretty much like yesterday. Melissa fit into this world perfectly. She wasn't trying to escape to somewhere bigger and brighter. She loved her hometown, loved the familiarity of it, the way she couldn't go to the grocery store without running into someone she knew. She was saving money, yes, and had dreams. But they were dreams that included staying close to family, building a life in the place that had always been home. On the night of May 14, 1995, she finished her shift at the restaurant around 9:30 in the evening. It had been a typical Sunday, decent tips, regular customers, nothing unusual or memorable. She clocked out, said goodnight to the kitchen staff, grabbed her purse from her locker in the back, and walked out into the warm spring night. Several people saw her leave. The cook, a man named Danny who'd worked at the restaurant for years, watched her walk to her car. A blue Honda Civic she'd bought used 2 years earlier and was ridiculously proud of. He'd later tell police that she seemed normal, happy even, humming something as she dug for her keys. A couple sitting in their truck in the parking lot, finishing their coffee before heading home, saw her get into her car. The engine started right up. She pulled out of the parking lot and turned left onto Highway 41, heading in the direction of her apartment. That was the last confirmed sighting of Melissa M. Johnson alive. What happened in the next few hours would remain a mystery for 29 years, but the impact would ripple through the community like a stone dropped into still water. Circles spreading outward, touching everyone, changing everything. Melissa never made it home that night. Her car was found the next morning, abandoned on a rural road about 12 miles outside of town, driver's side door open, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat with her wallet, money, and ID still inside. There was no sign of Melissa. The discovery of her empty car set off alarm bells immediately. This wasn't like Melissa. She was responsible, reliable, the kind of person who called if she was going to be 5 minutes late. Her mother had started worrying by midnight when Melissa hadn't called to say goodnight like she usually did. By morning, when her daughter still hadn't come home and wasn't answering her apartment phone, she knew something was terribly wrong. She'd called the restaurant, called Melissa's friends, and finally, with hands shaking so badly she could barely dial, she called the police. When officers found the abandoned Honda on Miller Road, a narrow 2-lane stretch that wound through farmland and woods, they immediately treated it as a potential crime scene. The area was rural, isolated, not a place Melissa would have had any reason to be. There were no nearby houses, no businesses, nothing that would explain why she'd be there. The car showed no signs of mechanical trouble. It started right up when police tried it. There was no evidence of a struggle inside the vehicle, but there was something that made every officer on scene feel a cold dread settling in their stomachs. Melissa's shoes. Her white sneakers, the ones she wore for her waitressing shifts, were placed neatly on the driver's seat, side by side, almost ceremonially. It was a detail that felt wrong in a way that's hard to articulate, a small thing that suggested something deeply disturbing. The search began immediately. Volunteers from the community, hundreds of them, combed the woods and fields surrounding Miller Road. Police brought in dogs, helicopters, dive teams for the nearby creek. Melissa's face was on every television in the region, her senior portrait smiling out from missing person posters that seemed to appear on every telephone pole and store window. Her family set up a command center at the local community hall, coordinating volunteers, fielding tips, holding prayer vigils. Her mother aged years and days, her eyes hollow with fear and hope, warring against each other. Her father stopped going to work, spent every daylight hour searching, calling Melissa's name until his voice went hoarse. Her sister gave tearful press conferences, begging anyone who knew anything to come forward. 3 days after Melissa disappeared, a farmer checking fence lines on his property found her. She was in a wooded area about 2 miles from where her car had been abandoned, partially concealed by brush and fallen leaves. She'd been murdered, though the specific details of how she died were kept from the public, the kind of information police hold back to help verify confessions and filter out false leads. The medical examiner would later determine she'd died the same night she disappeared, likely within hours of leaving the restaurant. The news of her death hit the community like a bomb. The vigils changed from hopeful to memorial. The yellow ribbons that had been tied around trees as symbols of hope now felt like gravestones. The investigation that followed was intense and desperate. Detectives interviewed everyone who'd seen Melissa that night, everyone she knew, everyone who'd been anywhere near Miller Road. They looked at ex-boyfriends, customers from the restaurant who might have made her uncomfortable, anyone with a criminal history in the area. They processed the crime scene with the tools available in 1995, collecting evidence, taking photographs, preserving what they could. They had some forensic evidence, samples that might contain DNA, but genetic testing was still in its relative infancy, expensive and time-consuming. They ran what tests they could, but without a suspect to compare the results to, the data sat in files, waiting for a future that seemed impossibly far away. As weeks turned to months, the active investigation began to slow. Leads dried up. Tips became less frequent, then rare. The detectives assigned to the case never closed it, never stopped thinking about it, but other cases demanded attention, and without new evidence or witnesses coming forward, there was only so much they could do. Melissa's murder became what every detective dreads most. It became a cold case. And in that transition from active investigation to cold case file, something precious was lost. The sense of urgency, the community outrage, the constant media attention, all of it faded like photographs left too long in sunlight. Life, as it always does, went on. But for those who loved Melissa, for the investigators who'd made promises to her family that they couldn't keep, and for the killer who'd taken her life and walked away, nothing would ever really be the same. The night Melissa disappeared had seemed ordinary until it wasn't, and that's what haunted everyone who'd been there. The Sunday evening shift at Miller's family restaurant had been typical for mid-May, a steady stream of families finishing weekend dinners, regulars nursing coffee and pie, nothing that stood out as unusual or threatening. But somewhere between the parking lot where Melissa's car had been parked under the yellow glow of a streetlight and the rural stretch of Miller Road where that same car would be found 12 hours later, something had gone terribly, irrevocably wrong. The question that would consume investigators for nearly 3 decades was simple and impossibly complex at once. What happened in those missing hours, and who had been waiting in the darkness when Melissa Johnson drove into the warm Tennessee night? The initial investigation moved with the kind of focused intensity that only comes when a community is reeling from sudden violence. Lead Detective James Hartwell, a 20-year veteran of the Davidson County Sheriff's Department, took charge of the case within hours of Melissa's car being discovered. Hartwell was known as thorough and relentless, the kind of investigator who didn't sleep much when a case was active, who kept notepads beside his bed because leads and connections often came to him in those quiet hours before dawn. He'd worked homicides before, but this one felt different from the start. The deliberate positioning of Melissa's shoes on the driver's seat, the isolated location, the lack of any obvious motive, it all pointed to something carefully planned, something cold and calculated. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was something else entirely. The crime scene where Melissa's body was found yielded evidence, but frustratingly little that pointed toward an immediate suspect. The wooded area was remote, accessible by an old logging road that hadn't been actively used in years. Whoever had brought Melissa there knew the area, knew it was isolated enough that they wouldn't be seen or interrupted. The forensic team worked the scene for 2 full days, photographing everything, collecting samples, documenting tire tracks on the logging road, searching for anything that might have been left behind. They found fibers that didn't match Melissa's clothing, hair samples, and most importantly, biological evidence that suggested the killer had left traces of himself at the scene. In 1995, DNA technology was still relatively new to criminal investigations, not yet the powerful tool it would become. The samples were preserved, sent to the state lab, processed as well as the technology of the time allowed, but without a suspect to compare them against. They provided more questions than answers. Detective Hartwell and his team started with the basics, the foundation of any murder investigation. They mapped out Melissa's last known movements with meticulous care. She'd left work at 9:32, according to the timestamp on the restaurant's primitive security camera, which showed grainy footage of her walking through the back door. Multiple witnesses confirmed seeing her get into her car and pull out of the parking lot. The couple in the truck, Jerry and Linda Morrison, had been clear about what they'd seen. Melissa had gotten into her car alone, hadn't seemed distressed or hurried, had driven away heading south on Highway 41. The next confirmed sighting of her vehicle was 12 hours later, abandoned and empty. That gap became the focus of everything. Investigators canvassed every business, every residence along the potential routes Melissa might have taken from the restaurant to her apartment. Highway 41 was a busy enough road, even on a Sunday night, but Miller Road, where her car was found, was a detour, a turnoff that made no sense unless you were specifically heading to one of the few farms out that way. Had someone forced her off the main road? Had she been following someone she knew? Had her car broken down despite showing no mechanical issues later? And had someone stopped offering help that turned into horror? The investigation into Melissa's personal life was exhaustive and painful for everyone involved. Detectives interviewed her family, her friends, her co-workers, anyone who'd been part of her daily world. They looked hard at romantic relationships, both current and past. Melissa hadn't been seriously dating anyone at the time of her death, but she'd had a boyfriend the previous year, a relationship that had ended amicably according to everyone they talked to. The ex-boyfriend, a mechanic named Travis Coleman, had a solid alibi for the night. Melissa disappeared. He'd been at a friend's house watching a basketball game, with multiple witnesses confirming he'd been there from 7 in the evening until well past midnight. Detectives verified every detail, talked to everyone at that gathering, even checked phone records to make sure calls had been made from that location during the time frame. Travis was cleared, though the process of being investigated devastated him. He genuinely cared about Melissa, and learning of her death had left him shattered. They looked at customers from the restaurant, and this opened up a wider and more troubling pool of possibilities. Miller's family restaurant had been in business for 15 years, served hundreds of people every week, and Melissa had worked there for almost 2 years. Had someone become fixated on her? The restaurant manager, a woman named Dorothy Chen, went through reservation books and credit card receipts, trying to identify every customer who'd been there that night. It was an impossible task, really, because most people paid cash, and Sunday dinner crowds were a mix of regulars and travelers passing through. Detectives interviewed the regulars, the people whose faces and names Melissa would have known. Did anyone seem too interested in her? Had she mentioned feeling uncomfortable around anyone? Her co-workers were asked these questions over and over, and the answers were always variations of the same theme. Melissa was friendly with everyone, but she hadn't mentioned any problems, hadn't seemed worried or afraid of anyone. One lead that consumed weeks of investigation time involved the man who'd been seen at the restaurant earlier that evening, someone the staff didn't recognize as a regular. He'd sat alone in a corner booth, had ordered coffee and pie, and according to one waitress, had seemed to be watching Melissa more than seemed normal. The description was vague: white male, maybe 40s, average height, dark jacket, the kind of generic details that could match thousands of men. A sketch artist worked with the waitress, created a composite that was released to the media and posted throughout the region. Tips came in, dozens of them, each one requiring follow-up. None led anywhere concrete. The man in the corner booth, if he was even significant, was never identified. Another avenue of investigation focused on the possibility that Melissa had been the victim of a serial offender. The FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program was consulted. Cases from surrounding states were reviewed, looking for similarities in method or victim selection. There had been other murders of young women in Tennessee during the early 90s, but none that matched the specific details of Melissa's case closely enough to suggest a definitive connection. Still, detectives traveled to other jurisdictions, compared notes with other investigators, looked for patterns. It was painstaking work that yielded little except the growing certainty that whoever had killed Melissa had been careful, controlled, and lucky. The forensic evidence, such as it was, became both a source of hope and frustration. The DNA samples collected from the crime scene were processed, and a profile was developed. But it was partial, not as complete as investigators would have liked. The technology in 1995 was improving rapidly, but it still had limitations. More critically, DNA databases were in their infancy. CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, had only been authorized by Congress the year before and was still being implemented across the country. Tennessee was working to get its system online, but it would be years before it was fully operational and populated with profiles. The DNA from Melissa's case was entered when the system became available, compared against known offenders, but there were no matches. The killer, whoever he was, either had no criminal record or hadn't been arrested for an offense that required DNA collection. As months passed, The investigation began to feel like it was running in place, expending energy but not making forward progress. Detective Hartwell refused to give up, continued to follow leads no matter how thin they seemed, but the reality was brutal and unavoidable. Without new evidence, without a witness coming forward, without a break in the case, there was only so much active investigation that could be done. The case file grew thicker with interview transcripts, forensic reports, maps and timelines, and theories that led nowhere. Melissa's family called the sheriff's department daily at first, then weekly, then less frequently, as the painful reality set in that their daughter's killer might never be found. The community tried to heal, or at least to scar over. A scholarship was established in Melissa's name at the local high school, awarded each year to a graduating senior who embodied her kindness and spirit. Her family held memorial services on the anniversary of her death. Smaller crowds each year, but always faithful friends and family members who refused to let her be forgotten. The spot where her body had been found became an unofficial memorial, people leaving flowers and crosses, teddy bears and handwritten notes that weather and time eventually claimed. The restaurant where she'd worked last saw her alive stayed in business for another decade before closing, though some of the staff who'd known her never quite got over the guilt of watching her walk out that door into danger they hadn't seen coming. Detective Hartwell retired in 2003, but he never really left the case behind. He kept copies of the files at home, continued to review them periodically, looking for something he might have missed, some connection that had eluded him. When new detectives were assigned to the cold case unit, he'd meet with them, walk them through everything he remembered, share the theories he'd developed and discarded over the years. He'd become convinced of certain things through his years working the case. The killer knew the area well, knew those back roads and isolated spots. The killer had likely seen Melissa before that night, had perhaps been watching her, planning. The careful positioning of her shoes suggested ritual or symbolism, something that mattered to the killer in a way that still made Hartwell's skin crawl years later. But knowing these things and proving them, connecting them to a specific person, that remained frustratingly out of reach. The forensic evidence sat in storage, preserved according to protocol, waiting. The DNA profile sat in databases, automatically compared against new entries as technology improved and more profiles were added, but year after year there were no hits, no matches, no breaks. Melissa's case became one of dozens, then hundreds of cold cases in Tennessee, a file that was reviewed periodically but had no active leads to pursue. Her family aged with their grief, her mother's hair going white, her father developing a tremor in his hands that doctors said was stress-related, but everyone knew was heartbreak manifesting physically. Her sister moved away, unable to live in a town where every street corner held memories, where people still looked at her with pity in their eyes. The detectives who took over the case after Hartwell retired did their best, but they were inheriting an investigation that had been picked over thoroughly, a case where every obvious lead had been exhausted long ago. They'd review the file when new forensic techniques became available, when DNA technology improved enough to warrant reprocessing old samples. In 2008, they sent evidence for updated DNA analysis, hoping that newer methods might extract a more complete profile or find something the earlier tests had missed. The results came back slightly improved, but still didn't match anyone in the system. In 2015, they looked into emerging genealogical DNA techniques, but the technology and legal framework for using it in criminal cases was still being developed, still facing challenges in courts. Through it all, the killer lived his life somewhere, hidden in plain sight or long gone from Tennessee, carrying the secret of what he'd done to Melissa Johnson on a warm May night in 1995. Did he think about her? Did he follow the investigation in the news, feel fear when detectives came close or relief when leads dried up? Did he ever visit that memorial in the woods, stand among the flowers and crosses, invisible among the mourners? These questions haunted the investigators who'd worked her case, haunted her family, haunted the community that had never quite felt as safe or innocent after losing one of their own to violence that seemed to come from nowhere. But evidence, properly preserved, doesn't age the way people do. DNA doesn't forget or give up or move away. And technology, relentless in its advancement, was approaching a breakthrough that would finally give Melissa Johnson's case the break it had been waiting 29 years to receive. The answer had been there all along, locked in biological samples stored in an evidence room, waiting for science and persistence to catch up with truth. The revolution in forensic genealogy didn't happen overnight, but when it finally reached Tennessee's cold case files, it moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that would have seemed miraculous to the detectives who'd worked Melissa Johnson's case in 1995. By 2023, the technology that had once been the exclusive domain of people searching for long-lost relatives and building family trees had become a powerful tool in the hands of law enforcement, a way to reach across decades and pull answers from evidence that had been waiting patiently in storage for our science to catch up. The breakthrough in Melissa's case began not with a dramatic moment, but with a routine review. A new detective named Sarah Chin going through old cold cases, looking for ones that might benefit from genetic genealogy analysis. Detective Chen was part of a younger generation of investigators who'd grown up with DNA evidence as a standard tool rather than an emerging technology. She joined the Davidson County Sheriff's Department in 2018, and by 2023 had developed a reputation for being thorough and tech-savvy, someone who understood how to navigate databases and work with genetic genealogists in ways that older detectives sometimes found overwhelming. When she pulled Melissa Johnson's file in the spring of 2023, she saw immediately that it was a strong candidate for genealogical DNA analysis. The preserved evidence included biological samples that had been properly stored, DNA profiles had been developed and were on file, and most importantly, traditional investigative methods had been exhausted without identifying a suspect. It was exactly the kind of case where genetic genealogy could make the difference between justice and obscurity. The process began with sending the DNA profile to Othram, a private lab specializing in forensic-grade genome sequencing. Unlike consumer DNA testing, which looks at specific markers, forensic genealogy requires building a much more complete genetic picture, one detailed enough to identify relatives even several generations removed. The sample from Melissa's case was degraded after nearly 30 years, but modern extraction and sequencing techniques are remarkably effective at working with less than ideal material. Over several months, the lab worked to develop a comprehensive genetic profile from the evidence, a process that required patience and expertise, but ultimately succeeded in creating a genealogical DNA profile suitable for database comparison. Once the profile was ready, it was uploaded to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database where users voluntarily make their genetic information available for law enforcement use. This was where the real detective work began, not the kind involving shoe leather and interviews, but a different sort of investigation that required understanding genetic relationships, building family trees, and following branches through generations to find the individual who matched the crime's CES and a DNA. The lab worked with a team of genetic genealogists, specialists who knew how to interpret the complex web of genetic matches and piece together family histories from fragments of information scattered across census records, obituaries, birth certificates, and genealogy websites. The first matches that came back were distant relatives, third and fourth cousins to the unknown suspect, people who shared a great-great-grandparent with the person who'd killed Melissa Johnson. These distant matches were enough to start building a family tree, working backward to identify common ancestors, then forward through the branches to identify all the descendants of those ancestors. It was painstaking work that took months. The genetic genealogist working closely with Detective Chen, eliminating branches that led to women or men who were too young or too old, or who'd been living in other states or countries in 1995. Slowly, inexorably, the tree narrowed, branches were pruned away, and the pool of possible suspects grew smaller. By late summer of 2023, the investigation had identified a cluster of individuals who fit the genetic profile and the investigative parameters. All were men who would have been adults in 1995. All had connections to the Davidson County area. All were descended from a couple who lived in Tennessee in the early 1900s. Detective Chen and her team began the careful process of investigating each potential match, looking into their backgrounds, their whereabouts in 1995, any connections they might have had to Melissa Johnson or the areas where she'd lived and worked. Some were quickly eliminated through additional investigation or voluntary DNA samples. Others required more careful scrutiny. One name that emerged from the genetic genealogy work was Robert Clayton Mitchell, a man who was now 62 years old but had been 33 in May of 1995. Mitchell had lived in Davidson County his whole life, had worked various jobs over the years, had been married and divorced twice, had adult children who'd moved away from the area. On the surface, he seemed like an ordinary person, someone who'd lived an unremarkable life in a small Tennessee community. But as Detective Chen dug deeper, details began to emerge that made her instincts prickle with the kind of recognition that comes when pieces start falling into place. In 1995, Robert Mitchell had worked as a delivery driver for a restaurant supply company, a job that would have taken him to Miller's family restaurant regularly. He would have been familiar with the staff, would have seen Melissa during his deliveries, would have known the area around the restaurant and the back roads of Davidson County intimately from his daily routes. He'd been questioned briefly during the original investigation, his name appearing in the files as someone who'd made deliveries to the restaurant. But he'd been one of dozens of peripheral individuals interviewed, and nothing had flagged him as a person of particular interest at the time. He'd said he recognized Melissa from the restaurant, but claimed he'd barely spoken to her, had been making a delivery on the afternoon of May 14, 1995, but had left hours before her shift ended. His alibi for that evening had been thin. He'd claimed to be home alone, but without evidence connecting him to the crime. He'd simply been another name in a very long list. Now, 28 years later, that same name was being connected to the crime scene through DNA, through genetic markers that don't lie and can't be explained away by coincidence. Detective Chen requested a search warrant for a discarded DNA sample from Mitchell, the kind of evidence that could be obtained legally without his knowledge. Investigators followed Mitchell for several days, waiting for an opportunity. They came at a coffee shop, where Mitchell had breakfast one morning, leaving behind a coffee cup and a napkin. The items were collected, preserved, and sent for DNA analysis. The wait for results felt interminable, but when they came back, they provided the confirmation the investigation needed. The DNA from Robert Mitchell's coffee cup matched the DNA from Melissa Johnson's crime scene. The odds of it being anyone else were astronomical, numbers so large they became meaningless. They had their killer, but knowing who had committed the murder and proving it in court were two different challenges, and Detective Chen knew that building a case strong enough to survive legal scrutiny would require more than just DNA evidence, as powerful as that was. The investigation shifted into a new phase, gathering everything they could about Robert Mitchell, his movements in 1995, his background, his history, looking for anything that might explain why he targeted Melissa Johnson or establish a stronger connection between them. They pulled old employment records, confirming his delivery route had included Miller's family restaurant. They interviewed his ex-wives, carefully, without revealing the full scope of the investigation, asking about his behavior in the mid-90s, whether he'd seemed different or stressed during that period. One ex-wife mentioned that he'd sometimes seemed obsessed with women he barely knew, would talk about them in ways that made her uncomfortable, but she'd never known of him acting on those obsessions. Investigators also looked into whether Mitchell might have been responsible for other unsolved crimes. They compared his DNA to evidence from other cold cases, looked at unsolved assaults and murders of women in Tennessee during the years when Mitchell had been living in the area. There were no matches, which suggested that Melissa's murder might have been his only violent crime, an isolated act that he hundred somehow managed to walk away from and bury deep enough that he continued living an outwardly normal life for nearly 3 decades. The decision to arrest Mitchell was made in early January 2024, after prosecutors reviewed the evidence and agreed they had a strong case. The arrest itself was planned carefully, executed early on a cold morning when Mitchell would be at home, before the story could leak to media and before Mitchell could have any chance to flee or destroy evidence. When Detective Chen and her team arrived at his modest house on Maple Street, when they knocked on the door and Mitchell answered, she searched his face for some sign of guilt or fear or recognition that this day had finally come. What she saw instead was a kind of resigned calm, as if some part of him had been waiting for this moment for 29 years, carrying the weight of what he'd done until it had become just another part of who he was. Mitchell was read his rights and taken into custody without incident. His house was searched pursuant to a warrant, investigators looking for any evidence that might still exist after so many years, any trophies or mementos that killers sometimes keep. They found nothing directly related to Melissa Johnson's murder, but they did find newspaper clippings about the case, articles from 1995 that Mitchell had kept, yellowed with age, folded and stored in a box in his closet. It was a detail that spoke to something dark, an indication that he'd followed the investigation, perhaps relived what he'd done through reading about the search for Melissa's killer, knowing all along that the person the community feared and hunted was living among them, invisible in his ordinary. The news of the arrest exploded through the community like lightning through a summer sky. Robert Mitchell wasn't a stranger or a drifter. He was someone people had seen around town for decades. Parents realized their children had gone to school with his kids. People remembered him from church, from the grocery store, from passing him on the street and exchanging polite nods. The betrayal of it. The realization that Melissa's killer had been there all along, living a normal life while her family suffered. While the community mourned, it reopened wounds that had never properly healed and created new ones in the process. Melissa's family, contacted by Detective Chen before the arrest became public, received the news with emotions too complex to easily describe. Her mother, now 78 years old and in declining health, wept when she learned that after 29 years, someone would finally be held accountable for her daughter's death. Her father had passed away 5 years earlier, his heart literally giving out under the weight of grief and questions that had never been answered. He died not knowing who had killed his youngest child, and that knowledge brought fresh pain to the family even as they experienced relief that justice was finally moving forward. Melissa's sister, who'd spent nearly 3 decades carrying survivors' guilt and sorrow, told reporters that she'd never stop believing this day would come. Though there had been many dark years when belief felt more like desperate hope than conviction. The legal proceedings that followed the arrest moved through the system with the deliberate pace of serious criminal cases. Mitchell was charged with first-degree murder, held without bond, appointed a defense attorney who immediately began reviewing the genetic genealogy evidence, looking for procedural issues or constitutional challenges. The use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations had been tested in courts across the country and had generally been upheld, but it was still relatively new territory, and defense attorneys had a responsibility to challenge the methods and ensure their clients' rights were protected. The preliminary hearings drew intense media attention, reporters and camera crews from across Tennessee and beyond descending on the small courthouse where Melissa's case would finally face legal resolution. Detective Chen testified about the investigation, the genetic genealogy process, the evidence that connected Robert Mitchell to the crime. Forensic scientists explained the DNA analysis, the statistical probability that the crime scene DNA belonged to Mitchell, numbers so overwhelmingly conclusive that they left little room for doubt. Mitchell sat through these proceedings with little visible emotion, his attorney taking notes, asking technical questions, but the weight of the evidence seemed insurmountable. As the case moved toward trial, prosecutors offered Mitchell a plea agreement, a chance to avoid a trial and accept responsibility in exchange for a life sentence without the possibility of parole. After consulting with his attorney, facing the reality of the evidence against him and the likelihood of conviction, Mitchell accepted the plea. In a courtroom packed with Melissa's family, friends, former investigators including retired Detective Hartwell who'd never stopped carrying this case in his heart, and community members who'd waited 29 years for this moment, Robert Mitchell stood before the judge and admitted to murdering Melissa Johnson on May 14, 1995. His statement was brief and provided few details about why he'd targeted Melissa or what had happened that night. He acknowledged that he'd seen her at the restaurant, had followed her when she left work, had forced her off the road on Miller Road. He admitted to killing her in the woods, to staging her car to mislead investigators, to living with what he'd done for nearly 3 decades. He offered no real explanation for why, no apology that could possibly bridge the chasm between his actions and their consequences. The judge accepted the plea and imposed the sentence of life without parole, and Robert Mitchell was led from the courtroom to begin serving a sentence that would end only with his death. Outside the courthouse, Melissa's mother spoke to the assembled media, her voice shaky but determined. She thanked the investigators who'd never given up, thanked Detective Chen and the genetic genealogists whose work had finally identified her daughter's killer, thanked the community for never forgetting Melissa. She said that while nothing could bring her daughter back, knowing that the person responsible would spend the rest of his life in prison provided a measure of peace she'd thought she might never feel. She spoke about Melissa not as a victim but as a person, as a young woman who'd loved life and people, who'd had dreams and kindness and a future that was stolen from her. She ended with a simple request, that people remember Melissa for who she was, not just for how she died. Detective Chen, standing with other members of the investigative team, felt the weight of 29 years lifting, not completely, because cases like this leave marks that never fully fade, but enough to breathe a little easier. She thought about all the people who'd worked this case over the decades, the ones who'd retired, the ones who'd passed away, the ones like Hartwell who'd carried Melissa's memory for so long. She thought about how technology and persistence had finally converged to provide answers that had seemed impossible in 1995. And she thought about all the other cold cases still waiting, other families still hoping, other victims whose voices were still silent, waiting for science and dedication to bring them justice too. The story of Melissa Johnson's murder, a story that began on a warm May night in 1995 when a young woman left work and drove into darkness, ended in a courtroom in 2024 with words like guilty and life sentence and justice. But it was never really just about an ending. It was about a life that mattered, about a community that refused to forget, about investigators who wouldn't let go, and about the inexorable march of truth that sometimes takes decades but arrives nonetheless. Melissa's grave, in the cemetery where her father now rests beside her, is still visited regularly, still decorated with flowers and remembrances. But now, when people stand there, they know that the question that haunted this place for 29 years has finally been answered, that the person who took Melissa from the world has been found and will never walk free again. In the end, that's not everything. But after so many years of darkness and uncertainty, it's something profound and precious. It's justice, delayed but not denied, and it's a reminder that some debts, no matter how long they take to collect, eventually come due.